It started with a leather pouch, worn soft from years of handling, drawstring frayed at the edges, heavy with gold coins that bore a brand nobody had seen in 6 months. She carried it into the auction like a woman carrying a dead man's last confession, and in a way, that's exactly what it was. What the foreman saw, Gil Farron had worked the Elkhorn Ranch for 12 years, and in all that time he'd never once stood on the wrong side of its fence. But here he was, late October of 1889, collar turned up against the cold, like a mourner at a funeral, watching a bankman in a wool suit auction off the only piece of ground that ever meant a damn to him. Cold morning, frost on the courthouse steps in Ridgeline, Colorado. Breath clouding from 30-odd townspeople who'd come to watch another man's failure get parceled off to the highest bidder. Nolan Avery's failure, specifically. 6 months gone without so much as a telegram. Ranch fallen to weeds, debt, and a silence so thick you could choke on it. Gil kept to the back of the crowd. Roy and young Pete flanked him, shoulders hunched against the wind. None of them spoke. What was there to say? The Elkhorn was dead. They'd all accepted it back in July, when the bank posted the foreclosure notice and nobody stepped forward to contest it. The auctioneer called the opening bid. A cattleman from Durango raised his hand, then a merchant from Pueblo, then nothing. That's when she stepped forward. A woman nobody recognized, tall, dark-haired, dressed for hard travel, not spectacle. She moved through the crowd, the way a person moves when they know exactly where they're going and don't much care who's watching. She carried a leather pouch, and when she set it on the auctioneer's table and loosened the drawstring, gold coins spilled across the wood like something fallen from another century. Gil's blood went cold. He knew those coins the way he knew his own hands. Every man who'd ever worked the Elkhorn knew them. Old Man Avery had stamped the ranch brand into each one a private currency. The old patriarch's fierce pride cast in metal. Gil hadn't laid eyes on those coins since the night Nolan rode out and didn't come back. Here's what nobody standing in that cold understood. Those coins hadn't left the Elkhorn in 20 years, and the woman who carried them knew exactly what that meant. She wasn't explaining herself to anyone. She signed the papers, collected the deed, walked out without meeting a single pair of eyes in that crowd. Gil followed her outside before he knew his feet were moving. "Ma'am," he cleared his throat, the words scraping rough against the morning air. "You're gonna need hands who know that land." She stopped, turned, studied him the way a person studies a horse before buying, not unkind, but measuring every ounce. "Monday morning," she said. "Bring whoever's willing." Then she walked toward the ranch road alone, and Gil stood there watching her go, wondering what in the name of God he'd just witnessed. The cold hearth. She didn't unpack that first evening. Not right away. Nora Guerra walked the Elkhorn property in the last gray light of October, cataloging damage the way a surgeon counts wounds, steady hands, clear eyes, feelings locked away somewhere she'd deal with later, south fence collapsed in 3 places, barn door hanging crooked on a rusted hinge, groaning each time the wind pushed through, water trough split clean by frost nobody had bothered to drain against. 6 months of neglect had a smell to it, dust and absence, and something faintly sweet, like hay rotting in corners where the rain had found its way inside. The house was worse. Dust lay thick as felt on every surface. A chair sat overturned by the kitchen table, knocked sideways by a man in a hurry or a man past caring which. A tin coffee cup rested where someone had set it down half a year ago and never picked it back up. She didn't touch the cup. She knelt before the stone hearth instead. Dead ash. Cold iron grate, a single log burned down to white powder that scattered when she breathed near it. This fireplace hadn't held warmth since spring, maybe longer. Nora struck a match. Her hands were steady. She fed kindling into the grate dry pine shavings, then a split quarter log from the pile beside the door. The flame caught, grew, steadied against the flue's first reluctant draw of air. First light in this house in 6 months, and she'd made it alone. She placed the empty leather pouch on the mantel. Her fingers lingered on the softened hide just a moment before she drew them back. From inside her coat, she pulled a folded letter. "Write it by firelight." The words moving across her face like shadows of something old and unfinished, she refolded it carefully and whispered 2 words to the empty room. "I'm here." The fire crackled once and held. Fence by fence. By mid-November, the Elkhorn looked like a place that remembered what it was supposed to be. Not pretty, not yet, but breathing. Nora had hired Gil back first, then Roy, then young Pete, who showed up on the 3rd morning without being asked, carrying his own fencing tools like a boy, hoping somebody would pick him for something that mattered. She worked alongside them. That was the thing that shut their mouths before any questions got properly started. Come sunup, she was already out, driving fence posts in ground that fought back with every strike, hauling wire until her palms bled through work gloves she never once removed in their presence. She didn't quit before they didn't eat before they ate. Afternoons, she cleared the well. Evenings, she fed the small herd she'd purchased from a ranch south of Pueblo, 12 head of shorthorn to start. Enough to say the Elkhorn was working land again. Town whispers reached them by the 2nd week, carried on the same wind that carried everything else in Ridgeline. Who was she, Nolan Avery's secret wife? Some figured a Denver investor, a woman running from trouble back east. The stories grew wilder with each telling, the way frontier stories always do when nobody's got the truth and everybody's got an opinion. Gil tested her once, asked about the branded coins while they were stringing wire along the north line. Casual as weather. She didn't flinch. "They bought this ranch legal. That's all that needs saying." He let it go. A man who spent 12 years reading horses learns to read people too. And Gil could see plain enough which questions would get answered and which ones would just hang in the cold air going nowhere. Every evening, Nora stood on the porch with her coffee, watching the road south toward town. Not anxious, patient. The way a woman watches when she's already calculated what's coming and is simply waiting for the arithmetic to prove itself. She never said what. But I can tell you she hadn't bought this ranch on impulse. She knew Exley who she was waiting for. The man on the road early December, first real snow sitting heavy on the high ridges. Nolan Avery came walking up the Elkhorn Road, like a man hauling his own coffin behind him. Gaunt 40 pounds shed from the frame he'd carried out of here 6 months prior. Limping on his right leg where a badly set fracture had healed crooked somewhere between here and the territorial capital. His clothes hung loose. His beard was unkempt and shot through with gray that hadn't been there in spring. His eyes were the eyes of a man who'd been staring at the ground so long he'd forgotten what the sky looked like. He carried one thing that mattered, a sealed letter from Territorial Judge Holloway, pressed against his chest inside his coat like a second heartbeat. He crested the ridge expecting wreckage. What he saw stopped him dead on the frozen trail. Smoke rising from his chimney. Mended fences running clean along the south pasture. Cattle grazing on winter hay spread in careful rows. The barn door hanging straight and true. Someone had rebuilt his life while he was busy destroying it, and the sight hit him harder than the cold ever could. Can I tell you something about shame? It don't care whether things look better or worse than you expected. Finding his ranch alive should have been a relief. Instead, it was an indictment. Someone did in weeks what he couldn't face in years. He walked down the ridge slow, bad leg dragging a line through the snow, and crossed the yard to the front porch. She was already there. standing in the doorway with a rifle resting across her arm, not aimed, not threatening, just present. Authority worn as naturally as the wool coat on her shoulders, dark hair pulled back, level eyes, hands roughened by the kind of labor his own hands had abandoned. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice carried the same temperature as the fence wire. "And I have terms." Nolan stood below the porch steps looking up at her. Wind cut across the yard, carrying snow crystals that stung his face. For the first time in 6 months, he had nowhere left to run. Bunkhouse rules. The kitchen table sat between them like a judge's bench. Nora had let him inside, not hospitality, necessity. Can't negotiate terms with a man shivering on your porch. She poured coffee, set it in front of him, didn't pour herself any. The distinction was quiet and deliberate. "The deed is in my name," she said. "Recorded legal at the county office. You left. The bank foreclosed. I bought it at public auction. With my coins." His voice was raw from disuse, cracked at the edges like leather left out in weather. "With coins in my legal possession." Nolan's jaw worked. He wanted to ask how she could see the question straining behind his teeth like a horse pulling at a bit. She didn't offer an answer. She slid a written agreement across the table. "You can stay and work the ranch, as a hand. Decisions are mine. You sleep in the bunkhouse with the others. This was my father's land. Was." That single word hung in the warm air between them. The hearth crackled behind her fire, not his. He told her then, halting and bitter as bad coffee, about the gambling debts, how they'd piled up across 3 years of poor judgment stacked on worse harvests, how creditors were days from seizing everything when he rode to Judge Holloway at the territorial capital to settle the accounts through the courts. 6 months of legal proceedings, his legs snapped clean, crossing the San Juan Pass in a late storm. By the time the debts were cleared and the judge's letter signed and sealed, the bank had already sold his home out from under him. Nora listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "That explains why you left. It don't explain the 3 years before." He had no answer for that. She knew he wouldn't. Monday through Saturday, first light to sundown, you answer to Gil, same as any hand. "Can I tell you something Nolan never admitted to anyone?" When the pen touched that paper, his hand didn't shake. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his grip was steady. No title left to hide behind. No pretending left to do. Just a man's name on a line. And the line was honest. He carried his bedroll to the bunkhouse. Gil was already inside, mending a bridle by lamplight. The old foreman looked at his former boss, now his bunkmate, and said nothing. The silence filled the room like cold water. What winter takes, 3 weeks of honest labor, and Nolan Avery looked like a different animal on the outside, leaner from the work, steadier in his hands, up before dawn each morning, breaking ice on the creek with a pickaxe, hauling feed through snow that came past his boot tops, mending fence in cold that gnawed through leather gloves like they were made of paper. The hands noticed. Roy mentioned it to Gil one evening over beans and biscuits. "He ain't the same man." "Man ain't been tested yet," Gil said. "Wait." Winter tested him on the 23rd of December. The storm rolled in after midnight, not the slow, dignified kind that gives a man time to prepare, but the vicious sort. All sideways wind and horizontal snow and a darkness so complete you couldn't see your own hand at arm's length. By morning, the barn roof had caved, the north section, the same section Nolan had patched during his second week back. He stood in the wreckage with his hands hanging dead at his sides. 2 calves injured, bawling in the wet straw, feed stores soaked through and ruined, snow pouring in where timber had splintered under the weight his repair should have held. Nora came out in her coat and boots, lantern raised, and surveyed the damage in silence that rang louder than any words she might have chosen. She didn't shout, didn't blame. She looked at the broken roof, then at him, then turned and walked back toward the house. Here's what that storm really destroyed. Not the roof, not the feed. It broke the thin new scaffolding Nolan had been building inside himself, the fragile, untested belief that he could work hard enough to outrun what he was. The old shame flooded back. His hands went still on the broken timber. His breath stopped short in his chest, and for a long moment he couldn't pull it back. Word reached ridgeline by sundown. The whispers shifted direction like weather vanes. Sea always was unreliable. Can't trust a man who runs. And that night, Nolan packed his saddlebag in the bunkhouse, quiet, practiced, the motions of a man who'd done this before and could do it in his sleep. Running was the one skill that had never failed him. He reached for the door. The foreman's truth, Gil Farron, was sitting against it, not standing sitting, like a man who'd planted himself there an hour ago and intended to stay rooted until spring if that's what the situation required. Arms folded across his chest, hat off. His eyes held the tired, patient look of someone who'd spent 12 years watching a person he cared about make the same wrong choice and had finally used up all his silence. "Move, Gil." "No, sir. I ain't askin', and I ain't movin'. Set that bag down and sit." Something in the foreman's voice, not anger, not sympathy. Something harder and truer than both made Nolan lower the saddlebag to his bunk. He sat on the mattress edge. His coat was already buttoned for the road. "You gonna tell me it ain't my fault," Nolan said, "that roofs cave and storms come and a man shouldn't carry blame for weather? Hell no. That roof fell 'cause your patch was shallow and you know it." Nolan flinched like the words had hands. "But here's the part you can't see, 'cause you're too busy drowning and sorry to look up." Gil leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "She didn't buy this place to punish you. She bought it to save it. There's a difference, and you're too blind with shame to see which side you're standing on. She don't need me here. Maybe not. But I've watched her face when you was working that fence line. She wasn't checking the wire, Nolan. She was checking you, trying to figure out if this version of the man was going to hold." Nolan stared at the plank floor between his boots. "I almost quit when she showed up." Gil continued, voice dropping to the register a man uses when he's telling the truth and doesn't care if it stings. "Figured no stranger had any business running land I'd bled for. She proved me wrong inside a week. You've had 3 weeks and change." He paused, letting the arithmetic settle. "Prove her wrong about you. What if I can't?" "Then you can't. But you don't get to say that from the road. You earn the right to say it here, after you've given this place everything honest you got. And if it still ain't enough, well, that's a verdict a man can carry without shame. But running before the jury comes back, that ain't courage. That's cowardice dressed up in a travel coat." Here's what changed that night. Not Nolan's heart that would take longer. And hearts don't turn on speeches no matter how good they are. What changed was his feet. For the first time in his grown life, they stayed planted when every instinct screamed at them to move. Dawn came gray and bitter. Nolan was already on the barn roof with hammer and nails. Alone in the half-dark. Breath rising white against an iron sky, building it right this time. Nobody asked him to. Nobody was watching. That was the whole point. Quiet proof, late January, and the elkhorn was holding steady as a good heartbeat. The barn roof stood stronger than it had in years, properly reinforced at every joint. Every timber doubled. The kind of work that said a man had thought long and hard about what he was building and what it would need to endure. Nolan had also mended the chicken coop where wind had torn the wire loose, split 4 weeks' worth of firewood stacked clean against the house wall, and repaired the side gate Nora had been fighting with since November, the one that stuck in cold weather and required a hip check to open. All unasked, all without a word seeking notice or praise. Gil reported it to Nora one evening, casual as if he were mentioning weather. The hands respect him now, not like before, not as boss, as a man doing more than his share and keeping his mouth shut about it. Nora nodded, said nothing. But the rifle she'd carried since Nolan's return had been leaning by the bedroom door untouched for 2 weeks. I reckon the moment that mattered most happened on a Tuesday morning, early enough that frost still laced the window panes in patterns that looked like fern leaves pressed into the glass. Nora came downstairs to start the morning fire and found Nolan already kneeling at the hearth, not lighting it, cleaning it, scraping old ash from the iron grate with his bare hands, careful and thorough, working the soot from the stonework so the draft would pull clean. The front door had been standing open. He hadn't crossed a threshold he didn't have permission to cross. His hands were black to the wrists. Soot darkened the lines of his knuckles, the creases of his palms, the places where calluses had thickened from weeks of honest work. He moved with the unhurried care of a man tending something sacred, not because anyone would see it, but because the task deserved it. He didn't hear her at first. She stood in the hallway watching, one hand resting against the doorframe. This man on his knees in a house that had been hers since October, tending the one flame she'd lit alone the night she arrived, not claiming it, serving it. Something shifted behind her ribs. Not forgiveness, that word's too clean for what this was. Recognition. She saw in those blackened hands and quiet movements a man who had stopped performing and begun simply doing. The kind of change that can't be faked because it only happens when nobody is supposed to be looking. He glanced up, found her standing there. For one held breath. Neither moved. "There's coffee on," she said. 3 words. The first invitation she had ever extended to him inside this house. The words were ordinary, what they carried was not. Nolan washed his hands at the basin, sat at the kitchen table for the first time since the night he'd signed her terms. The coffee was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and it was the finest thing he had ever tasted. The hearth drew clean and steady behind them, breathing the way a house breathes when it's finally being used the way it was meant to. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. 2 places saw set February settled over the Elkhorn, like a held breath slowly released. The days had found a rhythm, nothing grand, nothing announced, just the quiet accumulation of 2 people learning to work the same ground without collision. Nolan mended what needed mending. Nora planned what needed planning. Somewhere in the space between his labor and her judgment, a language had grown up between them that didn't require words. He'd leave the gate repair for her inspection. She'd nod once from the porch. He'd move on to the next thing. Trust built the way fences are built, one post at a time. Each one tested before the next goes in. The branded gold coins sat in a glass jar on the mantel now. Nora had placed them there sometime in January. Not hidden away in a strongbox. Not displayed for visitors. Just present. A fact that no longer needed arguing. His father's mark. Her purchase. Something that had passed through enough hands and enough meaning to become simply what it was, proof that one life had touched another, and neither would be the same. The sealed letter from Judge Holloway lay in the desk drawer, read and refolded and finished. The debts were cleared. The legal record was clean. What remained was only what 2 people chose to build from here. On a Tuesday evening in early February, Nora set 2 places at the kitchen table for supper. She didn't announce it, didn't pause over it or make it a ceremony. She set 2 tin plates, 2 forks, 2 cups on the worn oak surface, the way a person does when something has become habit instead of decision, when the choosing has already been done somewhere deeper than thought. Nolan came in from the barn, stamped snow from his boots on the threshold, saw the table. He sat down without being told, The hearth burned between them, the same stones Nora had lit alone in October, the same grate Nolan had cleaned on his knees in January. The fire had carried three meanings now: absence, then authority, and finally something that didn't have a name yet but felt like the first warm day after a long winter, when the ice starts talking in the creek and you can hear the ground remembering what it's supposed to do. Outside, Gil crossed the yard toward the bunkhouse, boots crunching on frozen ground. He glanced at the house and saw lamplight burning steady in two windows. Warm and even, the way light looks when it's got company. The old foreman allowed himself a smile, small, private, the kind a man earns after 12 years of loyalty, then pulled his collar up against the cold and went inside. The kitchen was quiet, venison stew and cornbread and coffee, nothing fancy. Two people eating supper the way people do when they've stopped measuring each other and started simply sharing the same table. The same bread, the same silence that doesn't need filling. Nora's hand rested near his on the worn oak. Neither reached, neither pulled away. The fire held steady. Frost pressed its lace against the window panes. And inside the Elkhorn Ranch house, for the first time, and longer than anyone in Ridgeline could remember, the cold hearth burned for two. If this story stayed with you a little longer than you expected, if something about a man on his knees cleaning ash from a fireplace that wasn't his anymore made your chest go tight, well, that's what the good ones are supposed to do. Some truths don't need explaining. They just need a quiet room and 2 tin cups.